floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, Lucas. So yeah, as he said, I'm going to be talking to you today about climate change and its impacts on conserving the world's amphibians. Before I get into my talk, I want to take a moment to thank you all for the invite. I'm especially inspired by the students being proactive about trying to tackle this crisis. And I applaud your efforts to learn more about climate change and what's happening to our natural world. So a little bit more about me. Maybe there we go. So I did, since I imagine many of you don't know me, but I did my bachelor's and master's at Michigan State in zoology and fisheries and wildlife. Zoology is now integrative biology. I then went to Mississippi where I could do my PhD to work on color evolution in poison dart frogs. I briefly did a postdoc in California before returning to Michigan State to Lyman Briggs College. So as Lucas said, my research primarily focuses around these animals. And I'm very interested in why they are colorful and why there's so many colors out there. So without getting too detailed into the weeds, essentially these colors are meant to warn predators of the poisons that these frogs have. And from a predator perspective, we expect that it's much easier to remember that orange frogs taste bad rather than having to remember that orange frogs taste bad and blue frogs taste bad and green frogs taste bad. So we expect that evolution would narrow color variation in animals that have this kind of defense. Despite that expectation, in a number of groups, and perhaps notably in these poison dart frogs, there's a huge amount of variation. So for example, in the upper left, that rainbow color of frogs, that's all one species from Central America. And in Panama in particular, there's a little archipelago. And where these frogs occur on the islands in this archipelago, each population is differently colored, despite these expectations of sort of having a unifying color. I've also worked on the population or the species on the upper right. This is called the dying poison frog. It's not dying because it's dead, but dying because it looks like it's tie-dyed. This is from Northern South America. And while it doesn't occur on islands, populations do get isolated from one another, and they have unique coloration. But as I said, this isn't necessarily restricted to these groups. The frogs on the bottom are actually from Australia. These are called Australian brood frogs. They're completely independently evolved. They're poisonous, they're colorful, and they show a lot of variation in coloration. So my research really focuses on trying to understand this why question. But before I get too deep into the weeds in that, I actually want to sort of introduce you to the problems associated with amphibians and the overall solutions to them. So first, I want to tell you who the amphibians are, the current conservation challenges for them, and then threats, including climate change, and then solutions and what's being done. So if you're not familiar with amphibians, they have a global distribution, every continent except Antarctica, and they're most concentrated in the tropics, with the highest concentration being in the Amazon. Now, the amphibians are comprised of three different large groups. And the first group I want to talk to you about is probably one that you have never seen before or not very familiar with at the very least. These are the caecilians. These are legless amphibians. They look like giant worms. They're solely found in the tropics. And they're very poorly understood, very poorly known. And that's because most of them are fossorial, meaning that they live underground. So it's very, very difficult to find them. But they are a really neat group of amphibians. They have some really complex parental care. Many of them will actually sort of brood their eggs until they hatch. And then the mothers will actually shed their skin and the larvae will feed off that shed skin until they're big enough to go on their own. And they're a fascinating group. The next group of amphibians out there are the salamanders. So there's about 760 salamanders. I hope everyone here is well familiar with these. If not, you should be, because this is sort of a highlight of the US. You can see that the highest diversity of salamanders is in the southeastern US in the Appalachian Mountains. And then the rest of the amphibians are frogs. All right, the vast majority of amphibians are frogs, and the biggest concentrations of diversity are in the Amazon, the Congo, and then Southeast Asia. Now, I want to break down kind of these numbers a little bit more. So as you can see, there's a little bit more than 8,000 different species of amphibians. And a lot of them are in trouble. So for example, this little sliver of the Sicilians, these are ones that are considered to be least concern by the IUCN. So the IUCN is this governing body that sort of tracks how the conservation needs of many, many different species, most, if not all, vertebrates, I believe. So you can see relatively small proportion of the Sicilians are least concern. Over half of them are data deficient, meaning we don't have enough information to know if they are endangered or if they're doing fine. And the rest, about 50 species, are considered threatened, endangered, vulnerable. They have some sort of status other than data deficient or least concern. For salamanders, there's a good chunk, maybe about a fifth of them, that are least concern. Fortunately, only about 50 species, we don't have no idea what's going on with them. But that is unfortunate that the rest, over about 540 species, have some sort of conservation status associated with them. Now, frogs, on the other hand, they're doing a bit better comparatively. Frogs, most, or about almost a little more than a quarter of them are considered least concern. A little less than a quarter are considered data deficient, but about half are considered endangered or threatened or have some sort of conservation status. So if we look at these numbers in another way, we can see about 17% of all amphibians, we have no idea what's going on with them. About 51%, almost 52%, have some sort of conservation status associated with them. Now, notably, this does include those that are extinct or extinct in the wild. For frogs, that's 30 species. For salamanders, that's 2 species. But if you add this all up, it comes out to almost 69% of all amphibians are either threatened or endangered, or we have no idea what's going on with them. So how does this compare across vertebrates? So if we just look at that threatened endangered number, that 51%, almost 52% for amphibians, and compare it across vertebrates, we can see that far and away that amphibians are the most imperiled vertebrate group. The next group that comparatively is the cartilaginous fishes. Those are like the sharks and rays. And about a third of species of sharks and rays are considered threatened or endangered. So what about amphibians in particular imperils them? Well, there's a few key features that are important for amphibians, but really cause them problems. The first one is that amphibian, hopefully you all learned, means that they have this biphasic lifestyle. They live in the water and they live on land. That's true for most species. Well, that means that if there's a change to water or land, they're going to be affected. The next one is that they have these unprotected eggs. So if you think of a chicken's egg, it has that shell on the outside. When you open up the shell, it has a membrane, and then you can get to the egg. That shell and membrane are very protective for these eggs. It really helps the embryos survive. Amphibians have no such protection. Their eggs are basically covered in just this jelly mass. And finally, they have this permeable skin. This is a really neat trait for amphibians because they can use it to respire. In fact, there's a group of salamanders, including some species that live here in Michigan, that have lost their lungs. They don't have gills. They solely respire through their skin. They're called the lungless salamanders. They can also use it to absorb water, get rid of toxins. You'll never see any amphibian drink. they always absorb the water through their skin. Unfortunately, that means it goes both ways. They can absorb toxins. They can, if their skin starts to dry, that prevents them from being able to get oxygen. So that's a real problem. So sort of showing where these are found, there's 5 major regions that sort of have big threats to them. So the first one is the Western US, then Central America and Northern South America, Equatorial Africa, Southeast Asia, and then the coastal Australia. And the reason why these amphibians are threatened in these different regions are varied. And I'm going to get into a little bit on some of the major threats between them. So if we want to break this down a little bit further and see like sort of this distribution, this is a nice map to show. So just to orient you a little bit, the numbers in red are the number of species that are critically endangered or extinct. The numbers in orange are endangered or vulnerable. And then the number in black at the bottom is the total number of species. So for example, in North America, you can see that almost a quarter of our species are considered endangered or vulnerable. Whereas in Central America, it's almost a quarter of the species there are considered critically endangered or extinct. So you can see that it varies by region. Some regions are more heavily affected by this amphibian crisis than others. So why are they threatened? Now, conservation managers, they sort of group threats in two different categories. So there's group 1 threats, these are ones that we really understand very well, that we have a lot of research behind them. We kind of understand the mechanisms that drive them. Then there's the group 2 threats, which are the ones that we don't really know all that well. So group 1 threats would be things like habitat destruction, alteration, and fragmentation, introduced species, and overexploitation. Group 2 threats would be things like UVB radiation, chemical contaminants, disease, and climate change. Now, while I don't have time to go into all of these different threats, I do want to highlight a couple of them: habitat destruction, disease, and of course, climate change. So the number 1 culprit here for amphibians declines is habitat loss. So habitat loss is implicated in 63% of species, and those that are threatened or endangered, it's implicated into 87% of them. So it's a very big problem. That's because habitat loss, among other things, it can cause microhabitat changes. So this can cause changes in temperature, moisture, pH, and so on, which causes problems for amphibians. As I just said, permeable skin and unprotected eggs makes this really problematic for them. They can't handle these fine changes as well as other species might be able to. However, the one that gets a lot of media attention, and I think justifiably so, is disease, in particular chytridiomycosis. Chytridiomycosis is a fungal disease that's caused by this fungus called Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, and it has been implicated in a number of declines and extinctions over the last 20 years. This is a very scary disease, and it's one that we're rapidly trying to figure out because it has spread very rapidly. And we're still pretty confused by it because this fungus, which we call chytrid fungus, it's typically infects invertebrates. This is the first instance where it has affected vertebrates, and it sort of caught us off guard. And as I said, it's been implicated in a number of or a number of declines and extinctions across the world. Now, unfortunately, there's a new species of chytrid fungus, Batrachochytrium salamander vorans, that was discovered just a couple of years ago in Europe, and it's been implicated in salamander declines. And this is particularly concerning because it's a new disease, and it seems to really negatively affect European salamanders. And wildlife managers, particularly amphibian conservation managers, are very, very concerned about it getting over to the US. Because as I showed, the US is the salamander capital of the world. And if this disease is able to get over here, it could spell disaster for our our species. So it's those are the two big culprits right now, although there are ranaviruses that have been implicated in declines, but these are much more poorly understood than the chytrid fungi. So just to show you how this has spread, this is sort of an old chart, but it's prevalent. So this really affected Central America. And you can see that it was started to be detected in Monteverde in Costa Rica. Remember this name Monteverde, because I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. In the late 80s, and it slowly, or pretty rapidly actually, kind of migrated through Panama. And at one point in the early 2000s, it got to the Panama Canal. It was the hope that the Panama Canal would prevent it from going over further into eastern Panama, into South America. Unfortunately, it has jumped the canal, and now it's well into eastern Panama. And the concern here is because of how much it affects particularly Central American species. So you can see that in Mesoamerican Central America, that there are a huge number of species, almost 80, that there have been 80 or 20 to 90% population declines. There's some that are even more so, and then a number that have either are presumed extinct, nearly 20 species, or actually confirmed extinct. It varies by region to region. And there's some areas, for example, Africa, that's not nearly as a great a concern as places like Central and South America. Australia, for this particular disease, Central and South America, as well as Australia, seem to be the big concerns. Now, unfortunately, there are a number of species that have gone extinct because of this fungus. And I just want to highlight a couple of them that are interesting. One of my favorite frogs is this neat little frog. This is called a gastric brooding frog. There's 2 species of this. And they're from Australia. They went extinct in the late 80s. And they're just an absolutely amazing frog, because essentially what they do or did is when they lay eggs, the female will actually eat the eggs, and she'll turn off all the digestive juices in her stomach. And she'll basically use her stomach as an incubator until the froglets totally metamorphose, and then she essentially vomits up a froglet, kind of what's shown here. And we lost that. And it's unfortunate for a variety of reasons, just the intrinsic value of this species, but also think of the sort of medical advances that could be known about figuring out how to deal with digestive issues that humans have. How can we sort of kind of calm down upset stomachs and things like that that could come from this particular species. Another species that is worth noting here is the Wyoming toad. So this is considered extinct in the wild, which means that conservation managers recognized early on that chytrid was going to be a big problem. So they collected as many as they could to bring into zoos to have a breeding program. Unfortunately, the wild populations have died out, but there is an active breeding program in zoos. So there's still hope for this particular species. So let's talk about climate change. And when we talk about climate change and how it affects amphibians, there's really, it'll have direct effects and indirect effects. So direct effects would be things like breeding earlier, the breeding phenology, and then severe weather events linked to climate change that are then linked to extinctions. There's evidence of this in Brazil and Costa Rica, Australia, the US. Then the sort of weedier stuff is the indirect effects. This would be things like immune response to the effects, more rapid metamorphosis, shifting of ranges. These are all things that are sort of indirect effects that we think are sort of caused by climate change, but it's harder to link them. So one of the big problems that amphibians have is this elevational problem. And I want to sort of tell this story with this neat salamander from North Carolina. This is the Chihuahua bald salamander. It is found on, I think, one, maybe two mountaintops in North Carolina. And this is a fairly typical trait for a lot of salamanders in the US. There's a lot of salamanders that are only found on a couple of mountaintops. I'm happy to get into sort of the evolution and how that happened. But basically, they're sort of relegated to these high elevation areas. And at lower elevations, there might be birds that are predators. Well, as the climate warms, the avian predators can move up in elevation. That's going to cause problems for the salamanders. So the salamanders trying to go for a more suitable climate will move up in elevation, and also to avoid potential predators. Well, if this keeps on happening, these salamanders, they end up running out of space, right? So if there's a population on that mountaintop, it's very shortly going to disappear because it can't go up anymore. And this is a very common problem for these animals. And I want to show you why this is a problem. And I'm going to focus on one of my favorite areas in the country. Is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And in this area, a couple of years ago, there was the massive Gatlinburg fire. You probably remember it from the news. It burned about almost 1,800 acres. Well, this is an area that has 42 different species. So what I have, this map here, there's 42 different species of salamander that occur in this relatively small area. And we have things like the Berry Cave salamander that's just outside this region. We have the Tellico salamander that's sort of southwest of that region. The imitator salamander, which is just found in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And then there's our Chihuahua bald salamander with that tiny little range. So you can see that if that fire happened at a different spot, say on Chihuahua bald, we might have seen an extinction in real time. And it's worth noting that these animals have a variety of designations. So the Berry Cave salamander is endangered. The Chihuahua bald salamander is considered vulnerable. So this is something that is of great concern because these little perturbations that could be exacerbated by climate change, like fires, could result in extinction of these species with very small ranges. So if we look at this, go back to this species distribution map across the world, there's a few sort of hotspots of biodiversity. So we have, for example, the West, Pacific Northwest, that has a lot of diversity. We have the southeast of North America that also has a lot of diversity. Central and South America, the Western Amazon, the Southeast Asia, and then the East Coast of Australia. Well, if we look at an elevational map and how that compares, most of these areas of biodiversity are associated with areas that are very variable in elevation, right? They're associated with mountain ranges. So as we see an increasing temperatures in climate, we're going to see these species moving up mountain ranges and losing, running out of space to go. So it's a very big problem for amphibians. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence that we do have of climate change and how it has changed these animals. So the first one is change in phenology. So if you're not familiar with that word phenology, it just means sort of the how they time their yearly events. So in this case, this would be breeding, right? So how do they, when do they start breeding? Do they breed earlier, later? They stop breeding, things like that. Well, there's a study that was done that looked at historical data in the US and the UK, and they found that some species, like up top here, this is a natterjack toad, this is smooth newt, and then the grass frog. These are all UK species. These were breeding earlier. In the US, wood frogs, bullfrogs, and gray tree frogs also were breeding earlier, but it wasn't universal. There were some species that were not affected at all. So things like the common toad, the marsh frog, boreal toad, or the American toad, these all didn't change their breeding phenology. And then there were some regional effects. So I'm hoping that we're going to start hearing these guys soon. If you're not familiar with this guy, this is one of my favorite frogs because it tells me that all this white stuff outside is going to disappear. This is the Spring Peeper. And this study found that there were some areas where they started breeding earlier and other areas where they didn't. So it's complex, essentially, in terms of how is it going to change their breeding patterns. Now, at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the curious case of the golden toad. This is a really cool species in Costa Rica. It's one of the very few amphibian species out there that is sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males look distinctly different than the females. So this is a male on top that gives its name, the golden toad, and a female on the bottom. And these are native to Costa Rica. They're from that Monteverde region that I highlighted earlier. And they're found on one ridge in Monteverde. They're known as, well, before I get into that, their range is about 10 square kilometers. So if you find this difficult to highlight or to think of how big of a range or how small of a range that is, here's the state we know, Michigan, right? So this arrow is pointing to a tiny island. You actually can't really see it up there in Lake Huron, Mackinac Island. All right, most people here, if not everyone, is familiar with Mackinac. It's a very popular tourist destination. This box here is 10 square kilometers. So these frogs, these toads, lived in an area about the size of Mackinac Island. And they were discovered in 1966, and they're what we call explosive breeders. And what that means is they, at the right time during the year when it's particularly wet, they come out en masse and they breed. They put all their effort in maybe a couple of weeks, and then they